Great. Well, Bryce, it is right about 4:45, so we'll go ahead and introduce you. Thanks for joining us today and hanging in there, everyone. Bryce Wiggley from Delta Junction, who has a large barley farm down in Delta, is going to talk all about creating food system resilience using local production and processing. And will Milo be joining as well?
No, Milo's busy making more flour.
Okay. All right. Well, I will be your moderator today. I'm Heidi Rader with UAF Cooperative Extension Service. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, or if we have time later on, you can turn your video and mic on. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Heidi, and thank you for everybody that was involved in the selection process. I appreciate the opportunity to present here. My name is Bryce Wiggley. I'm the owner of Alaska Flour Company. You know, I've thought a lot about this last few months. It seems like in America we squabble about a lot of stuff, and you know, we argue about masks or whether to not wear masks. We argue about whose lives matter, whether we should be carnivores or vegans, and I really think that the reason we are able to do that is because we have plenty to eat. You know, there's a lot of hungry people in the world who would think we're crazy for spending that much time and energy on those topics because they're hungry, and a hungry man only has one problem. His thoughts are preoccupied with finding enough to feed his family for that day. And planning for food security is not an option for him. It's not a reality. That opportunity is past. So if you don't have food, you really don't have, you're just not in planning mode. Well, food security in Alaska has declined, I think, since the 50s. But every time there's an event that causes shortages of food, we think about food security. When the crisis passes, then we stop thinking about it. This happens on a regular basis, and the COVID pandemic that we've been going through just makes us aware once more of our precarious situation relating to food security. Our food system is vulnerable to several pressures. Right now, we're talking about how we can increase our food security, but because social and environmental challenges are so unpredictable, in the span of a few days, we could be actually looking at how do we meet the need of feeding our family? Things just happen so fast, and we never know what is going to happen. And so I think that it's important that we work on this while we can and whenever we can. Many people have a default response mechanism to difficult challenges, and that is basically to hope it doesn't happen. My philosophy or my feeling is that I believe that we have to prepare for that possibility rather than hoping it won't happen. So that's why we started Alaska Flour Company, was to increase our food security. Now I want to set the stage for our discussion today. Let's see here. How do I get that there? Okay. By introducing you to my farm, this field that you're looking at right now is 140 acres. Our farm has 12 acres, or excuse me, 12 fields this size. Now, all of that acreage, 1,700 acres, is less than 1/40th of the land that is currently being farmed in Delta. My neighbors raise most of the hay, the grain, the peas in the state, a lot of the meat. But just as exciting as the production is that several of the farmers are also starting to process the raw product that we raise into food for Alaska. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I wanted you to visualize farming on a scale that most people in Alaska don't see. And it doesn't exist anywhere else in the state at this time. So Alaska is at the end of a very long transportation line. It doesn't have very many redundancies. We barge most of our food up. Some comes up on the Alaska Highway, and then about 5% is grown here. Barges break down, bad weather happens, natural disasters, terrorism, strikes, all of these things challenge the integrity of our food system. But these events don't even have to happen in Alaska to affect us. So we don't have control of most of the things that impact our food, our food system. We've already experienced a lot of these things, and when they happen, we remember how important our local food supply is. But as I mentioned, most Alaskans kind of forget about that as soon as the transportation is moving and the shore shelves fill back up again. My family never forgets it. We talk about it. We talk about it every single day. We talk about how we can increase our food security all the time. We do something to directly improve our food security every single day. We've had a lot of wake-up calls in Alaska to improve food security. But remember what I said earlier about the hunger man who only has one problem. We have a 3 to 5 day supply of food on the shelves in the grocery stores. And that's not enough to last if that barge doesn't run. So as a quick refresher, here are some of the recent events that have impacted our food supply. I'm not going to discuss all of them, but I want to highlight 3 of them because of the potential impact to our food chain. First of all, in 1989, I remember my son was like 6 months old at the time. The barge wasn't able to dock in Anchorage, and within a week, the store shelves were nearly empty. That single event illustrates how vulnerable we are and how little time it takes to go from pretty good to desperate. The majority of our food does come up on the barge. The second thing I wanted to mention was earthquakes. I heard that in the last session. We live in a seismically active area, and we just deal with earthquakes. We face them all the time. 2 recent earthquakes remind us that for all of our technology, we don't control those natural disasters. We live with the possibility of sudden and severe disruption of our world. So how would you feed your family if another disaster like the '64 earthquake happened? And what if it happened during the wintertime? For sure, outside resources would be brought to bear to the extent that it was possible, but all of that takes time. I've often said that when your body gets cold, it protects the core. Your fingers and your toes are extremities, and your body will conserve the blood flow to make sure that your vital core is protected. And the same thing happens with countries. When a widespread disaster occurs, the rule of the greatest good for the greatest number is what is followed. And eventually resources do recover and expand assistance to the communities that are farther from the core. Nobody wants to cut Alaska off, but the fact is that we are an extremity. If we're not prepared to take care of ourselves, we might not be taken care of. Oops, let's see. There we go. There are important lessons that we can learn from Hurricane Katrina. So here's New Orleans. It's a city that is connected by several major transportation systems to the breadbasket of America just a couple hundred miles away. And yet with all the resources that America could bring to bear, it took 2 weeks to get food to those people. Now, how long do you think it would take to respond to Alaska? Just think of any disaster that you may have seen reported on the news. maybe the earthquake in Haiti, tsunami in Indonesia, the war in Ukraine, or a hurricane in wherever. You can see buildings torn apart, streets littered with debris. All of that makes impactful visuals for the news. But think about the people who are living there and what they're going to eat and what they're thinking, what's going through their mind. If you were there, where would you get supper tonight and the next night and the next night for whoever, for however long it took? Those are the kind of things that we generally don't think about. Now, the third event that I wanted to discuss, and the focus of this presentation, is actually the impact that the COVID pandemic has had on our food supply, our food security. So for the last 12 years at least, I've been around the state. I've talked to the legislature. I've talked to various administrations. I've talked to groups of people just like this about food security and how we needed to prepare for it. I've mentioned earthquakes. I've mentioned the road closures, but in every meeting and discussion we had, I also mentioned the impact the pandemic could have on our food security. Now, I didn't know anything about COVID when we were talking about that stuff. The pandemic that I was really focused on was bird flu. But the resulting chaos of the COVID pandemic teaches us a lesson and reminds us that we are not prepared. Remember when I said that when your body gets cold, it protects the core first, and countries do the same thing? When the responses to COVID were being planned, Alaska was an extremity. And at one point, the mitigation plans included closing the port of Seattle. Governor Dunleavy was discussing plans for the National Guard to go down and keep it open. Nobody wanted to cut Alaska off, but the fact is those in charge were trying to save their own lives. So again, if we're not prepared to take care of ourselves, we may not be taken care of. Oops. There. Okay. I'm getting a little bit of lag on my slide changing. So our food system is globally interconnected. We can get grapes and oranges and kiwis all year long, even though none of them are grown here. And usually the just-in-time delivery system works pretty smooth. But when you toss a bomb like a pandemic into the pot, things get messy pretty fast. Thinking of the shortages that occurred during the pandemic, what was it that surprised you the most? And I got to say that for me, I did not see a shortage of toilet paper coming down the road. That was the first thing I noticed empty on the store shelves. I was pretty confident in our ability as far as a producer to continue milling operations. I thought they would be okay because we had lots of barley and we could just make it into food. But what I didn't expect to see was a shortage of sugar and baking powder that we use in our mixes. And while you may not have been impacted so much by the store restrictions that they put in place, you couldn't have more than one bag or buy more than one bag of sugar, for example. You may not have been impacted so much by those restrictions, but we buy sugar by the pallet in 50-pound bags. So a limit of one per person was not going to go very far. And at one time, we purchased the last 17 bags of sugar we could find in the state from a distributor in Anchorage. There's 4 major meat processors in America. 4 major meat processors. All of the meat plants are owned by those 4 companies. And they completely closed several plants and throttled the rest of them back to skeleton crews in response to COVID. And this reduction in processing capacity created a severe bottleneck for the ranchers and the farmers and the feedlots that were trying to get their animals to market in prime condition. The end result was that they had a glut of animals on the farms, but not enough meat to meet demand. And then we were going along about 6 months, 5 months, 3 or 4 months into the pandemic. About May of 2020, we got a call from the buyer for one of the grocery store chains in Alaska. And he said that they couldn't find any flour on the whole West Coast. And he asked if we had anything that we could send. So we immediately started bagging flour for that order. We sent 6 pallets to him that week. And then the shopping habits changed. There was a huge shift in people's shopping habits during 2020 and 2021. The fear of being exposed to COVID caused a lot of people to stay home and they turned to online shopping and ordering from the stores for pickup. So we refined our shipping options, offered an option for free shipping in Alaska for orders over $50. We also worked with the stores to get our products listed in their ordering system so that people would continue to have access to local food. So I think it's important to note that shortening the supply chain allows us to pivot quickly in emergencies. On the morning of 2018, November, I think it was, there was an earthquake in Anchorage. That morning, we were already sending several pallets of products down to Anchorage. So short supply chains allow access to fresher food, and they make us more responsive during emergencies. The COVID pandemic increased our sales actually because people started thinking more about food security. But a food system has got to do more than just provide food. It also needs to provide a balanced diet. I really like this Alaska food pyramid because I know they get a different thing than food pyramids, but I grew up with them, so they make more sense to me than this USDA plate thing. But anyway, I like this pyramid because it shows Alaska grown products in all the food groups. And that's important because when we talk about local food being available in an emergency, we really need to look at a variety of local food so that we have a balanced diet. Now, all of these products that are shown on that pyramid are grown or made in Alaska. Some aren't done commercially, but they could be. Everybody who eats is involved in agriculture, and there's room for everyone in agriculture. So there's room for the large grain farmers and for people who want to run a feedlot or raise thousands of animals. There's room for dairies and large vegetable farms, but there's also room for farmers who want to sell at farmers markets and do CSA boxes. There's room for farmers who want to make cheese or ice cream or butter. There's room for families to raise a cow or a couple pigs or sheep or chickens in a backyard. There's room for people who want to be involved in processing those raw products into meat cuts, jams, jellies, juices, and hash browns. There's room for all of that. We have so much need and so little going on. I don't know how many times I've said, man, this is a land of opportunity. Anywhere you look, you can see an opportunity. When we talk about food security, we can't just stop at production because our local system has got to include the processing of food into forms that people are accustomed to eating. Most people don't want a side of beef. They want a steak or a roast. They might even want a seasoned prime rib or a dozen eggs. We need to do that. And then it needs to be put into the stores where it's available, where people can find it all the time. Now, I want to introduce you now to some farmers who are already doing that in Delta. So Alaska Range Dairy is owned by the Plegerman family. They came up several years ago from Washington, where dairying was, when they were in Washington, dairying was what they did. They currently milk 35 cows. They just started this year, and they provide 2,100 pounds of grade A pasteurized milk every day. They use a robot milker, and it lets the cows get milked whenever they want. It reduces the labor challenge. The robot tests the milk as it's milking, and it ensures the highest quality milk goes into the tank. The milk is then pasteurized and bottled right at the dairy for sale. Alaska Range Dairy is adding barn space this summer and expanding to 50 cows this fall. They're adding another robot milker this summer and hope to be milking 80 cows by next year. Now, with 80 cows milking, they'll produce 1.8 million pounds of milk a year for Alaska. 1.8 million pounds of milk for Alaska, and that's just one farm. Now, there are other dairies for both cows and goats around the state that are producing milk right now. The Muggeridge Hay and Cattle Company raises beef in Delta. Scott and Justin Muggeridge came from Nebraska. A lot of years of cattle raising experience, cattle feeding experience. Their cows and calves are out on pasture. Man, they get so fat out there. And then they finish their beef on grain that is raised in Delta. And last year, they produced 350,000 pounds of finished meat. That's not 350,000 pounds of animal. That's 350,000 pounds of cut meat after it was slaughtered. And there are several other farmers in this area who raise hundreds of beef and pigs in Delta. McCullums and Pinkelmans, the Bates, Greens, Knops. There's some of the farmers who are not only raising animals, but they're also processing them. We hope to increase that number in Delta to 25,000 animals raised each year and eventually. And when that happens, we will be able to provide 12.5 million pounds of meat for Alaska. Alaska Flour Company is my company, and we mill Sunshine Hulless barley. Sunshine Hulless barley was developed by UAF. We raise it on our farm, and then we mill it to make over a dozen products for every meal of the day. From breakfast cereals and pancakes to couscous, cornbread, muffins, we make a wide range of barley-based foods that offer plenty of variety to keep meals interesting. The capacity of our current flour mill is over 5 million pounds a year. We're nowhere near that yet. We have lots of room to grow. The farms in Delta Junction currently grow over 12 million pounds of grain every year. Some is for food, some is for feed. And if there was a market for it, we could grow 100 million pounds a year. That addresses a little bit of your question on that earlier, Heidi. What would it take to achieve a significant measure of food security in Alaska? The current proposals being floated, and they've been floated in and out over the last several years, they include warehouses to store food in preparation for future shortages and emergencies. And I agree that storage of some food makes sense, especially for dried foods that can supplement our own production, such as seasonings, dried fruits and vegetables, dried milk, etc. The difficulty with storage is that you have to have a systematic method of rotating it, or else so that it stays good when it's needed and doesn't just get dumped on the market. And the best way to have a strong food system is actually to have local production and processing. I believe that the state should set a goal to achieve I've always maintained that it should be a 90-day supply of food that will provide a balanced diet. We may not have everything that we currently have access to, but I think that we can get to that point where we have a 90-day supply of different kinds of food that will provide a balanced diet. So that 90-day supply needs to be represented by more local food moving through the normal distribution chain. If it's moving from the farms through the stores, it doesn't have to be warehoused or rotated at additional expense to the state. The normal flow of commerce takes care of the rotation and the distribution. So rather than being squirreled away in huge expense in warehouses, the majority of the food is actually stored on the farms, in the flocks and the herds, the feedlots, the barns, potato cellars, the grain bins. In other words, the food supply doesn't have to be all in the freezer or in the pantry at any given time. It needs to be continually used and replenished in the normal course of farming and commerce. So how much would it take I got behind on my slides there. How much would it take to achieve a 90-day supply? This chart shows what it would take for a handful of products that are currently raised in Alaska. And it doesn't include everything. I just picked a handful of things. And it's important to note that this is the amount we would need to have in the pipeline at any given time, because we can't predict when we'd need to rely on it. So in most cases, these amounts are achievable within a few years. It isn't so much a problem producing food at this level as it is of being able to get that food into the food system. The existing food system needs volume and it needs quality year round. And while some farms are already producing at those levels, a lot more are needed. There are a number of things that the state can do to encourage the development of the local food industry. Oops. There we go. Unfortunately, they don't cost a lot of money. Reviewing policies and regulations to ensure that they encourage the development of a local food system. Reading the various agencies' regulations will turn up a list of expensive regulatory requirements that act to discourage new startups in the food production and processing. We need new farmers, we need new processors, we need new markets to justify expanding food production. But we need to look at the regulatory burden that prevents new farmers from entering the food system. Involving farmers in this review would help agencies see things from a different perspective. Lots of times you get tunnel vision. This is my job. This is the way I look at things. It's important to step back and look at things from a new perspective. And that's why I think involving farmers in such a review would help. The incentive to compel agencies to undertake such a review would have to come from the top. I don't think that there's the will or the interest in doing that from an agency standpoint. But if the state was to get serious about food security, I think that that's something that should be done. I'm happy that our own DEC has been open to suggestions in recent years, and they've made some allowances for small operations. For example, the cottage food regulations that came out a few years ago. And I think similar collaboration with other agencies could also help facilitate agricultural activity. Alaska should use influencers to mount a public relations campaign that is focused on encouraging Alaskans to purchase locally grown food. A whole bunch of states aggressively do this. Explaining the benefits to our economy and our food security would inform and influence Alaskans to ask for locally grown food in restaurants and in the grocery stores. Having a market is essential to increasing food production in the state, and the state could do a lot to open those doors. Legislators, mayors, civic clubs, the governor, those are some examples of influencers that could help get this message out. So put something in your newsletters, mention it in your discussions when you're talking at clubs or constituencies. Use local grown food yourself so that you can talk about it. Lead by example, basically. The state also has the ability to open new and larger markets for local food by purchasing it directly from farmers or by requiring certain percentage of local items be sourced locally in their food contracts. Access to state markets would give farmers an opportunity to scale up their production if they wanted to. A few years ago, a legislative audit by Representative Tarr found that the state bought $41.6 million in food through their contracts, but only 1.2% was sourced locally. And as a state, it seems like we ought to be able to do a lot better than 1.2% when we view the purchases as an investment in Alaska's security. The proper wording on state food contracts and enforcement of that language could greatly increase on the market share of state purchased foods in institutions, food service establishments, and receptions. After many years, I'm happy and I'm encouraged by reports that there has been some movement at the state level for that to happen. So we'll see what develops from that. Most people work 40 hours a week. They work for 8 hours a day and go home. They do whatever they want. Usually have a couple of days a week they're off. In the course of a year, a typical employee works 2,080 hours, of which 80 hours is paid time off. Farmers typically work 12 hours a day for at least 6 days a week. And during planting and harvest periods, it's common for them to work 16-hour days every day for 2 or 3 weeks. They spend about 3,700 hours a year. And if they do take time off, it's not paid. Their commitment to producing food is astonishing. And that's one reason the farmer demographic is getting older. Most people don't want to work that hard. The farmers in Alaska are doing what they can to increase food security by raising food. And as you can see, that's a full-time job. Some farmers are even processing that food, which is not typical for a food system. Usually the food processing is done by other parts of the food chain. I think that the fact that farmers are stepping up to the plate and investing additional time and money into processing the food they raise so it's available for Alaskans is a measure of their commitment to food security. So the question is, what can the rest of us do to acknowledge that commitment? Well, we can support local production by asking for it at the grocery store and the restaurant. It's not hard to ask the store manager if they have any Alaska grown food and let them know that you'd like to see it in their store. And I guarantee that if the store managers hear a dozen requests a day from shoppers asking for local meat, local milk, local produce, local grains, things will happen. Some things are more expensive. It's true. Local milk is a couple bucks more. I can afford a couple bucks. You can afford a couple bucks. That's nothing. But the cumulative effect of many people spending a couple bucks more on local food is unbelievable. A few years ago, Ken Meter, who is an economist, did some work for the Alaska Food Policy Council. He estimated that if every Alaskan spent $5 a week on local grown food, it would account for $187 million per year. So $5 a week is a good way to say thank you to the farmers' commitment to keeping Alaska fed.
Thanks, Bryce. I just wanted to let you know we're almost at time, but you did have a great question too. So I just wanted to have time for that. Oh, go ahead.
I need to look it up.
Oh, I'll read it out for you. It's
Okay.
Brad St. Pierre. What about the inputs to grow that food, i.e. fertilizer? How would that be locally produced for that size of a farm? If you are using imported nutrients, how would that be able to sustain a local food system if shipping was not happening?
So our fertilizer does have to be brought in. There are some things that can be done in terms of cover crops, things like that, that you can maybe ameliorate a little bit the need for fertilizer, but to produce food for a whole state, it's going to require commercial fertilizer. And so unless we can, so those kind of things are going to continue to be needed. They're going to be needed in America. They're going to be needed anywhere that food is being produced. And certainly they're going to continue to be needed here. I don't have the answer on how do we guarantee that those fertilizer shipments continue to get put in here or brought in here. But this year, for example, we're looking at at least a 40% increase in fertilizer costs. And I was listening to a podcast earlier, and some farmer down in America had gone and bought his fertilizer. It was 300% higher than it was last year. And I mean, how do you deal with that? You have to pass those costs on. So there are going to be times when food becomes more expensive. We're very fortunate in America. About 10% of our dollar of our earnings goes to food. So one dime out of every dollar that we make goes to food. And that's why we have such a good lifestyle, because we have all this disposable income we can buy stuff with. Most countries spend a lot higher percentage of their income on food than what we do. And so, yeah, it's just like gas, how do you keep the price of gas down? It's one of those functions of the market. You have to deal with it, and we'll have to deal with the inputs to farming as well.
Thank you so much, Bryce. I think we're going to have to move on over to our next presentation here. But Bryce is speaking tomorrow again, so maybe you can catch him at that presentation for more questions. Thanks, Bryce.
Sharon, there it is. Never mind. I found it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And next up, we've got Ann Fisher and Tracy Robillard with conservation assistance with NRCS. They're going to talk about seasonal high tunnels, soil health, water management, and more. So go ahead and spotlight them, and we'll get started. Ann, are you there? Tracy? See Ann. You want to just go ahead and turn on your video or start sharing? There's some.
Is it coming in? Hello, sorry.
It's blinking.
Oh, what's going on with that? Maybe I'll try something else here.
Oh, now I see you. Well, yeah, you're coming in good.
Okay. Let me. Sorry about that. We could have gone. I love listening to Bryce. It was great to have Bryce on there. Bryce is a lot more interesting and intriguing than I am.
Well, Bryce is still here, so if you want a little extra time to get organized, we can take
go
questions.
ahead.
Ask more questions.
Ask your questions while I try to get this.
I did see one from Carl. It said, what about all the fish guts from fish processing plants? The offshore mega factory trawlers throw over billions of tons of fish, let alone processors onshore. guess that's more of a comment than question. So.
Yeah, you're correct, and certainly fish is a component that can provide some nutrients. So we look for a balanced nutrient load or nutrient ratio when we to me, just like your own nutrient needs as a person, soil and different crops need certain nutrients as well, and some of those can be met by fish waste. Somebody's got to save that, you know, they're throwing it overboard, then somebody's got to save that, and then it's got to be processed in such a way, dried or something slurried, and it's got to be applied. So it looks like Anna's up now, so I'm gonna stop talking.
Thanks, Bryce.
Well, Tracy's up actually. Thank you, Tracy. Are you ready to go?
You're muted.
Oh. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. Good deal. Sorry about that. It's been a long day for everybody, but great information. Really appreciate listening to everybody today on the conference. And I'm personally pretty excited about listening to all of this, because all of it's been a real passion of mine. So it's fun to get to work and talk in this arena, even though I'm talking about government programs. So I guess I'll back up a minute and just tell you who I am. I'm Ann Fisher. I'm the Assistant State Conservationist for Partnerships at Palmer, Alaska for NRCS. With me is Tracy Robillard. Many of you have probably heard of or from Tracy in the past. She's our public affairs specialist. And Tracy, I'll let you say a few words if you would.
Sure. Hi everyone. I'm just here to be a cheerleader for Ann and to share some information about some of our conservation financial assistance programs that we have. So I'll turn it back over to Ann, and hopefully you can still see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Okay.
I can. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the programs we offer, but I guess I want to start out just a little bit and connecting it to some of the conversations I've heard today. So and to actually just reach back just a little bit to some of what Bryce was talking about and the nutrition of food. So whether it's large scale farms like what Bryce is working with, or the small scale farms, where most of us are working with the soil. And some of the work I've done previously, we really got into the food production and how it relates back to healthy soil. And I've been involved in some conferences and working with some groups that have been actually measuring that. So what we're finding is the more diverse and more healthy soils you have, the more micronutrients and collectively nutrient dense food we get. And that transfers on to livestock as well. So some of the work that's being done are evaluating, beef, chicken, worms, you name it, and what they're eating, and that transfers over to what we're eating. And in fact, that's even an ongoing research right now, I think at Yale University, where they're looking at the health of people in relationship to the health of the food they ate. So it's just a really exciting time. So I offer that to talk about programs. So some of what we do in NRCS is to help facilitate some of those healthy foods through healthy soils and healthy ecosystems. So Tracy, if you would. So we are under the heading of the USDA, and the Natural Resources Conservation Service is a federal agency. Our motto is helping people help the land. And we work with all the natural resources. We call it SWAPA, just so we can remember it, or some of us can remember it. Soil, water, air, plants, animals, plus humans and energy. And primarily our work is done on private lands. So we're leaving Forest Service lands to the Forest Service and BLM lands to the BLM and that kind of thing for the most part. But work on private lands, and that includes in Alaskan tribal lands. Our history is founded in the Dust Bowl. And I guess I'm going to stop here. It's been a long day, and I know everybody is zoomed. And so if you could, I think you can have a reaction. If everybody that has heard of Hugh, Hammond, Bennett could do some reaction in the reaction button, that would be great. So anybody who's heard of Hugh, Hammond, Bennett previously, do one of the reactions. What are your choices? A hand or a thumbs up? There you go, Tracy, thanks. So there's a few of you who've heard of Hugh, Hammond, Bennett. So he was quite the, not just a soil scientist, but he was quite a speaker, quite a passionate invoker of soil conservation in our history. During the Dust Bowl, he went all over the United States and was very passionate about seeing the destruction of our soils and what we could do about it. So he's the one who actually went to Congress, and there's a great story I won't go into right now because it is a long day, and I'll let you research that on your own or maybe for another day. But he was our father. He begged, pleaded, and presented why we needed to preserve the soil in the United States and what it meant to us. So with that, and shortly thereafter, we established, it was established, the Soil Conservation Service, which has now become the Natural Resources Conservation Service. The first presence of SCS, as it was initially known, in Alaska was in 1948 in Palmer. Go ahead. So our assistance is based on a very voluntary effort. So we're not regulatory. We're not making people change, and that can be up for debate sometimes. Some people would like us to be sometimes, but it's very voluntary. So we work as people request our assistance. Generally speaking, we wait for somebody to come to us, unless we're at a group setting such as this, or somebody requests us to come out to their place to look at something. But it isn't we're going to come out and tell you what you should be doing with your place. It's private lands, and it's goal oriented. You can see on the slide there, it says your land, your goals, your choice. It's what the goals of you and your operation are. And that's the basis that we start with. Okay, Tracy. So with that, we offer technical assistance, and generally speaking, somebody will contact us and say, I have this, whatever it is they have for a concern, and would somebody come look at it, or could somebody direct me someplace to help me with this issue? And so we have technical experts on our staff, and you can see the list of them. I'm not going to read them to you. So we have all of those people to call on. So at the state office, we have a state biologist, state agronomist, etc. But in the field offices, we have planners, and those planners will be the ones that will initially be working with the producer, with the person that asked for assistance, because they're the ones that look at the whole picture. They call on our experts as needed, but the planners will start the process and try to identify with you what your goals are. Okay. So once those goals are developed and resource concerns are identified, then we're looking for ways to mitigate those issues. And sometimes we have some financial assistance that can help mitigate those issues. And those come in different programs that you can read up here. EQIP is the Environmental Quality Incentive Program. CSP, these are the acronyms that you'll hear readily. CSP is the Conservation Stewardship Program, and ASEP, the easement program. Those are our three probably foundational programs. Go ahead. So as I mentioned, we start with the conservation plan. We assess the area you would like to work with and come up with a plan. So that plan isn't our plan, and sometimes that's mistaken. It's a plan between the producer and the planner. After we evaluate the resource concerns and the issues that you'd like to address. Okay. And those, I guess, at the bottom, there isn't a charge. This is part of our service, as what we do basically. So the resource concerns are listed. I didn't even honestly know this website was out there until Tracy, by the way, all these slides were Tracy's creation. Thank you. We have a marvelous public affairs specialist, a wizard, really. Anyway, she sent these slides to me, and I saw this slide. I went, God, I've never even seen this website. So this is a website that you can go into if you're curious about what kinds of things we're looking at. And I just had a question the other day about soil, something, what was it? Something with soils, but all of these resource concerns, soil, water, plants, animals, and air and energy, have a tab that you can actually go in and see further what kinds of things that we will be looking at. So if you go to the next slide. And I'm going to have to make my screen bigger because I can't even see that. So all of those things come up, and there's a whole host. This is just to give you some example that those things come up if it's one of the issues or resource concerns that you have on your place. You can check it and you can just add it, as you can see over to the right side of the screen. And at the end of the day, if that is or isn't a resource concern, you'll see the ones that were resource concerns for you. So you can just click through there and see all the different things that you would like to address or that you feel are at least an issue or a concern. Okay, Tracy. So that resource concerns list shows up. So it's kind of a cool website. I just wanted to break off a little and show you that because it's kind of cool how it comes up, because then it gives it to you in a format that you can make notes on the side, and that's where you and the planner can sit down and discuss different issues and opportunities. So one of the things that we've strived for in the agency in the last 10 plus years is managing for healthy soil, because it seems as if we manage for healthy soil, we're addressing the healthy soil, but we're also addressing healthy water and healthy air and all the other parts of it. So with regard to the healthy soil, we have 4 principles listed up here. I, generally speaking, will use 5, just because I think the 5th one can make a big difference. But we'll start with these 4, the maximizing continuous living roots. And I could geek out right now and get into this, but I guess for the sake of time and everybody's wanting to have supper at some point in time, I'll let it go. Minimize disturbance, maximize biodiversity, and maximize soil cover. And some of the sessions I was on today talked quite a bit about all of these things, so I was pretty excited. The 5th principle that I like to add is animals. Adding animals, and Tracy and I talked about this the other day, and I mentioned it isn't just adding animals, it's intentionally adding animals. And by that I mean, you know, if you had a field of cover crops and you throw out a herd of cattle, that isn't necessarily going to add much to your to the health of your soils. It'll add a little bit, but if you rotated those through a strategic grazing system, then that's what I mean by intentional, because then you're moving the manure and urine from place to place instead of stacking it by the water tank. And the other thing is, it doesn't have to be cattle. It could be chickens. It could be whatever, you know, size and space you have. And if you don't have animals, that's fine too. But it does add a layer of appreciative soil health. So I'll stop there. Thanks, Tracy. So some of the conservation practices for local food production that we utilize through the EQIP program, that Environmental Quality Incentive Program. One is the high tunnel system, and this system is just to extend the length of the growing season. Probably most of you have seen these or have these or have looked at them. And that's one I've been surprised since coming to Alaska. They're all over the state. So that's one that we can help provide financial assistance to. Okay. And nutrient management. Nutrient management, I guess when a lot of people think of nutrient management, they think of big farmed fields and, you know, fertilizer and some of the conversation we just had, but it also applies to gardens. It applies to high tunnels. It's managing that and recognizing that more isn't always better, and you know, really testing. And I heard Kyra talking earlier today about setting a base level, and that's the same in nutrient management, because you have to know where you start. You need to know where you're going. So you can manage your nutrient management by doing soil tests and plant tissue tests and all kinds of things. So that's another practice that we can provide some financial assistance in helping you keep those records and doing those tests. Conservation crop rotation. So you can minimize some of the effects of weeds and disease and compaction, things like that. So we do some financial assistance with regards to conservation crop rotation. And along with that, I'll just add, because I know it's not in this, is some cover crops. We do some multi-species cover crops, financial assistance for that. Irrigation water management, timing and regulation of applications, making sure that the water meets the needs of each species of plant out there, and adjusting that as necessary. So that's another practice. Irrigation systems, which look a lot different in Alaska than anywhere I've seen, just because of the number of these high tunnel systems and the local growing. So lots of opportunity to do some unique things there. So EQIP is probably where most of the financial assistance for those types of things have come from that we've used in Alaska. And it can be based on your whole operation, and that can be anywhere from, you know, a couple or, you know, less than an acre to 10,000 acres. And it just depends what specific areas and resource concerns you'd like to address. Another program we have that we haven't used a lot in Alaska, but it's the Conservation Stewardship Program. So basically that's a program that takes someone to the next level. Generally speaking, you've addressed the resources concerns, so you've stopped the bleeding, if you will, if you've, you know, had a gully, let's say, or you've had something that was, you just really needed to stop. And this would be more building that soil or making it even better. And so the practices within the conservation stewardship program are designed to be a little bit higher level, if you will, to take that producer to the next level of where they were. So it's based on a 5-year contract. And just like EQIP, it's a competitive contract. So we have X number of dollars and we rank them based on, who's going to address the most resource concerns. And that's how they're ranked within the state. Some of our other programs involve easements. The Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, or ASEP, we have wetland easements and eggland easements. Wetland easements are held by the producer. Eggland easements are held by a third party, generally speaking, a land trust, someone like that. And the landowner receives payments based on land value. And it's a much more complicated process than this. But if anybody has some interest in that, we have Jackie Craigle at our state office is our contact with that, and she can give a whole presentation on this and does a wonderful job with it. So questions, help, anything ideas, contact your local NRCS field office. These up here are listed, the different field offices and the contact numbers. If you have any other questions, I'm happy to answer whatever I can today. Otherwise, I'm going to rely on Tracy to put our email in the chat, if you wouldn't mind. And I guess I appreciate everybody staying for this. This is, as I said, it's a long day, and it's been a great day. So
thanks, Anne. And
tomorrow.
You did have a couple questions. I don't know if you saw those in the chat, but
I didn't. No, sorry.
I think mostly about like timeline, like how long it would take to get a high tunnel.
Like applying for funding?
Yeah, I think so.
So our programs have a funding cycle, if you will. You can apply for any of our programs at any time, but we need the time to be able to plan with you. So let me give you a for instance. If you went into one of the field offices right now and said, I'd be interested in this, they'd sit down and they'd assess the fact that you are an egg producer and that you have egg land to put that on, because there are some stipulations or some eligibility requirements. And then they would work with you to come up with a plan and a design. And that would be throughout probably the summer. And you would submit an application at any time in there. But the next funding cycle would probably be next, this time of year, next year.
Okay, thank you.
Charles,
go ahead.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, the Sickle Local Foods Network, we do St. Peter's Fellowship Farm. We decided we were going to put a high tunnel on our property, or actually it's leased property, but whenever we looked into it, it was like November or December, and we were trying to get a high tunnel built before March so that we could start using it. And the timeline would have taken us past the start of our growing season, so we would have lost the whole year. And so we ended up purchasing it on our own. The next year we did the same thing, though we just purchased it without really checking. But is there a way to work on the timeline to make it a better fit for whenever people's growing seasons are, so people can maybe get the stuff and gear during the off season, but be able to have their high tunnel ready to go for the start of the growing season? Because that was something that to get all the paperwork and reimbursement, it was going to, we just weren't going to fit the timeline.
Right. And that is something that happens with some of our practices. There are a few practices that I see it happen more often with. I guess the only advice I could, because we have a lot of national and of course budgetary things that we have to work around. That's when, you know, Congress allocates a budget for us. We don't always know how much funding we're going to get in which program. So there's just a lot of background noise there. So I guess like the only advice I could offer is to be visiting with your local office and keep them apprised of if you think next year you'd be considering
Yeah,
another.
we're in Sitka, so we don't have a local office to visit.
Okay, so Juno would be your contact. Well, so Samia, and I know she has a couple new couple planners over there, and they'd certainly be willing to work with you.
Yeah, but it ended up that we ended up paying for it ourselves and finding other grant sources for it. But it really made it kind of frustrating to not be able to match a timeline to whenever you needed it for production.
Right. Yep. There's definitely some planning involved with all of our programs. There's some timelines, and
yeah. So it ended up we could buy it and build it ourselves, but we wouldn't get reimbursed.
Sure.
Well, I think we are right about at time. Yeah, I know the program takes a fair bit of navigating, so we've got Ann and Tracy's email here if you're interested in any of their programs. Thank you so much for presenting on your important programs. And this is the last session of the day. So we'll see you all back hopefully tomorrow, and have a good evening.
And thank you everybody for sticking with us. I appreciate it. And thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks, Anne.